evening, everyone from London. In my case, I want to welcome you to our penultimate session on behalf of myself, but also my friends, colleagues, co-organizers, Katalin Sende from CEU and Susanne Rau from University of Erfurt. And all three of us are delighted to be able to introduce tonight a speaker who will extend our kind of global panoptic view of cities and civic participation in word and stone. That's been a kind of a leading light for us this term. And again, we're inviting back an old friend and colleague who we all know from various conferences and projects and publications, and this is Dr. Griego Boykov, who is currently a member of the Austria Academy of Sciences Institute for Habsburg and Ottoman Studies, and that gives you a very good sense of what his field is. And he has a PhD in Ottoman history from University in Ankara, which he obtained in 2013. And prior to joining Austrian Academy of Sciences, he was in a number of places in the Balkans, including University of Sofia, where he taught, also the CEU in Budapest. He was also a research fellow at the Netherlands Institute in Turkey. I had a number of junior fellowships, including Mellon Fellowship at the American Research Institute in Turkey. And really quite a kind of array of fascinating projects, including, and I think this is the one that you referred to, Grigor, in our email exchange, the Horizon 2020 widening program, project on population geography of Bulgaria, 1500 to 1920, really interesting sounding project situated at Koç University in Istanbul. And Grigor wrote to me that he's primarily interested actually in people, which is a good place to start from when looking at cities and civic participation. So in population and space, and therefore population geography, and that it's this that actually led him to cities, architectural patronage more generally. And I just want to mention a couple of publications I think already out. It's The Social Networking in Southeastern Europe, 15th to 19th century, which is a co-edited volume with Maria Baramova and Ivan Parvev. That's Münster 2021. So is that out, Grigor, or is that about to come out?
It's out.
It's out. Well done. Congratulations. And for those of us particularly interested in cities, maybe I can mention a couple. Cities in Southeastern Trace, Continuity and Transformation, also co-edited volume, which was published in 2017 in Sofia. And the T-shaped Xavier, Imarites in Edirne, a key mechanism for Ottoman urban morphological transformation, which is an article in the German Journal of Ottoman and Turkish Studies Associations. Anyway, but that's enough from me. We're going to now hear from Grigor himself, who's got this, I think he gets the prize for the most lyrical title in the whole series. So it reads as when the land of Filibe became Egypt and Meriç turned into Nile governance, architectural patronage, water management of the mid-15th century Plovdiv conformation. So Grigor, over to you.
Thank you, Zoe, for this generous introduction. Yeah, I hope my talk today will do at least some partial justice to the raised expectations that he laid ground for. Let me just try to share my screen first, and please make a sign if it works. Actually, do you see it? Yep, wonderful, Patrick.
All good.
See you. Yep. Well, so if you allow me a slight correction, you mentioned the Institute of Habsburg and Ottoman Studies in the Austrian Academy of Sciences. Not quite yet. I see your logic, but the institute is called the Institute for Habsburg and Balkan Studies. So, kidding aside, I would also like to take the opportunity to extend my thanks to the conveners for giving me this opportunity to present some parts of my research in this lecture series. And this lecture series apparently engage a wide spectrum of intertwined questions relevant to the general theme of urban governance and civic participation in a variety of ways. So also it gives me a great pleasure to be part of this, how should I put it, broader academic discussion, which goes beyond the geographical limits of Europe and brings within the larger Mediterranean, but also Eurasian perspective by pointing to the nature of differences, but more importantly, to the similarities of shared spaces in multiple temporal and spatial contexts. So before resorting to my own presentation today, it would be only natural to outline some of the notions that were already put forward by the previous speakers, with which my talk will engage into rather more direct conversation. So the first notion that I would like to point to is the notion of space. It was, in my mind, present throughout the lectures with a broader emphasis on geographical regions and their differences and similarities. And that was said already by the first talk by Martin Prag, but recurrent in the following lectures too, most outstandingly, I would say, in Sarah Keller and Susanne Rau's presentation last week, which I sadly missed, but I had the opportunity to see the video of. It is also worth recalling that the space was a central theme with regards to the specific urban settings of physical structures. For instance, that was the case of Caroline Goodson, but also epigraphic inscriptions that were loaded with altered meaning depending on the particular vocation, intended audience, and respective patrons, as showcased by Fabrizio Nevola. Urban topography and space were dominant conceptions with regards to specific processions, namely those of gallows, as highlighted by Achim Timmermann. But urban space was also very much perceived as an abstract spiritual equilibrium in Mughal India, and again with reference to Keller and Rao's talk. We were also reminded in passing by Miri Rubin that there is a tangible continuity in urbanism inherited by most urban centers from their predecessors. But another time, the notion of urbanism was also pertinent to newly built cities that developed on sites without inherited urban structures, as, for instance, was often the case in Mughal India. So the second notion that I would like to highlight is the notion of practical citizenship, which was again put forward by Martin Prag. Seems to be another path of inquiry throughout the lecture series, or at least to me. An emphasis was laid on the civic participation of a variety of social, professional, and religious groups who actively participated in urban governance and negotiated their own representation within an urban, but also within rural settings, as presented by Bit Kumin. The civic participation, determined mostly by a set of practices rather than a specific legal status, was closely linked to the notion of agency that extended to the groups of artisans, merchants, various guilds, brotherhoods, fraternities, and corporate groups, religiously defined communities, but also town planners and city administrators as social welfare and beneficents, but also armed protection of cities, as demonstrated by Martin Scheutz. The notion of immigration and newcomers to the city, introduced by Miri Rubin, is another aspect that is closely intertwined with the broader notion of difference and toleration within urban centers that were hence presented with the challenges to recognize and negotiate various sorts of differences and to maintain heritage at the same time. All these concepts presented so far by the speakers, needless to say, broaden the scope of the discussion and account for wider complexities of general questions of governance and civic participation. In my talk today, I'll be engaging mostly with the notion of governance and not so much with civic participation, and will try to bring several other dimensions to it. Focusing on one particular city in the Ottoman Empire, I will naturally address the question of space in a variety of ways: geographical and built, inhabited or unoccupied, inherited, appropriated, and superseded at the same time. Bringing the notion of space into close correlation with people, I'll be also touching upon the questions of immigration and religious and ethnic diversities. Focusing on particular period of the city's development and on architectural patronage of one of its governors, I will bring forward the question of governmental agency that is often obscured by the umbrella of the anonymous state and the nameless state officials, and will suggest, largely in convention, of course, with the proposed notion of practical citizenship, that one may equally speak of a practical governance as well. This practical governance was not only an epitome of an individual agency, but was an active participant in local welfare and a converser with the local communities and urban society as a whole. So that said, let me introduce you to the spatial actor of my talk tonight. And for those who are familiar with Balkan and East European geography, that will be a place that will be very well known. That is the second largest town in today's Bulgaria, an important place since, I would say, since at least the late antiquity or even earlier. And like many cities, it was very strategically located. You know, most cities would claim that they are strategically located, but Plovdiv or Filibe for the Ottomans was particularly strategic, held a particularly strategical position in terms of communication. So on the one hand, as you can see, it lays on the highway through the Balkans, the Roman Via Diagonalis, and also from the town split a number of other smaller secondary roads, which are, I would say, also very important. So that one would lead to Skopje and further to Dubrovnik, controlling the trade. To the east, there is a road running towards the northern road, connecting the city with the Romanian principalities in Moscow at large. And there were two secondary roads cutting through the mountain and joining the Via Egnatia and then the Adriatic coast. But more importantly, like many cities, Plovdiv or Filibe also sat on the river. And today, it's very difficult to imagine that until quite late, until the 19th century, that was a river floatable on rafts, probably up until Pazogic, and a lot of goods were transported on the river, and the river played, of course, an important and major role in the life of the city. So that said, let me just give you a brief idea of the topography of the town. The town is sort of located on 7 hills. What you don't see in the case is the 7th hill, so there are 3 hills connected here, and there are 3 more, and one was leveled down in the early 20th century for paving the roads of the town. So it disappears from the digital elevation model that I'm using here to portray the topographic situation of Plovdiv. That you see also is the Ottoman urban fabric that we'll deal more with it in the coming minutes. The important thing to note about the topographic location is that you can see from the north, the city is bordered by the river, which offers a very good natural protection. And these hills were always inhabited, to the best of my knowledge, at least since the Neolithic times. There was always been settlement. So rushing through the history of the town, it was really an important city for the Romans, who developed the urban tissue south of these three hills with the citadel. And there were a number of important public buildings and edifices, and here you see the reconstruction of the agora, or the forum, and the stadium, which will come back to the stage later on in the talk. So Roman city is relatively, I would say, relatively well studied, and we know quite a lot about it. The same cannot be said about, unfortunately, about the situation with the medieval Plovdiv. The data that we have is very dispersed, and also in a very premature stage of compiling and also analyzing. So the best that I could have done is to look into those sites, into which I know certainly that there were medieval materials and they were probably inhabited in the medieval period, and try to juxtapose this with the Roman and for future Ottoman tissue, just to see where eventually people might have lived in the medieval period. But as you can imagine, this is highly tentative, and also could be in a way misleading, because most of the urban fabric is densely built in today, and those excavation sites that we see on the map are rather a result of emergency rescue excavations that were carried out in the last 50 years or so. So I don't know how well representative are they. So coming to the Ottoman town, I'll not take you into the details of the conquest. Say it was conquered in 1360s by the Ottomans, and trying to build, to get a better idea what happens once the Ottomans take over what eventually might have been the medieval Philippopolis. I worked on compiling a rather, I would say, sophisticated, integrated database. And I'll not be talking about this database at all today, although it's one of my passions, and I'll be happy to get questions about it in the Q&A section. But for the time being, just take my word that most of what you see is spatially, temporarily, and also historically reliable. Of course, given that nothing's entirely reliable in this world, but the result of those recreations of urban tissue come as a result of my research in the last years. What we can make out of that, once we spatially reference all the data that we can receive and play with it, is a series of models that can give us a better idea of what exactly was going on. And since today I'll be talking about the person who governed the city in the 1460s and 1470s, I would like to start with the closest, and that is actually the earliest population census that we can find. And I distributed the population data just to give you an idea what the city looked like, say 100 years after the Ottomans took over. I'll not get into the details of the source. It has its problems, and the data is not entirely reliable to the last person. It renders down to the individual data, but we have some issues with people not being actually included in this early register. But what you can see, just as a different viewpoint, we have a city in the 1470s. We already find a city that has a predominantly Muslim character. The Christian community remained to live in the place where they most likely lived in the pre-Ottoman period. That's to say, in the citadel and the stronghold, and the slopes below it, and the Muslim neighborhoods slowly surrendered that space. So, but that's the situation in 1472. In a minute, I'll come to the point. How do we get there? But before that, wanted also to give another overview and to compare. The Ottoman approach towards the city was completely different than the Romans. The Ottomans decided to, whoever the Ottomans are, to build the city in a completely different direction, abandoned the Roman open plain, and decided to go into this area here and focus the most of economic and urban activities in that part here. My hypothesis is that's probably due to that bridge, which is an Ottoman invention, which redirected the traffic and actually formed one of the main axes of development of the city, which, as you can see, passes on top of the Roman stadium, which on its own, it means apparently that the stadium was underground. So two more axes cross the city east-west, and those leading, joining together further down the road, leading to Adrianople and Istanbul, and those axes joining, leading to the Rhodope Mountains and further west, if you wish. So that's a very brief overview of what you can do with the layout. But what I would like to bring you to is to step back in time before the population register, which I showed you, and look into the formation of the urban core. So what do we basically know about the town after the conquest is very little, because for about 100 years we would lack documentary sources, and the chronicles would be very brief, not relating too much about what's going on in the city. But nevertheless, we would know that this area and the citadel would be reserved to the Christians. And I would think that the earliest Muslim settlement and Muslim buildings must have appeared in this area, which unfortunately we have some data about the existence of such buildings. For instance, there was an extramural bathhouse that was used in during the wars of Ottoman princes. That's in the beginning of the 15th century, and there must have been also other buildings around it, but they disappeared due to the warfare and to the destruction during the battles. But still, if one looks at the population density, and that is 1489 is the earliest population register that provides relatively reliable information. So we can see that these are actually the parts with the highest population density. So I would think that such a hypothesis is also confirmed by the concentration of people in this area, making it the most likely early location of settlement of the first Muslim colonists. So that said, we don't know much about the early 15th century, but the big change we know begins with the 1430s. And it is in a way set by this building, commissioned by Sultan Murad II. And let me just give you another view of that, so that you get a visual idea of how did it look like. So this is a large Imperial Mosque that was unfortunate. That's actually a very unfortunate building, because a 17th century influential Ottoman traveler claimed it to be a construction of Murad I, so the grandfather of Murad II. And since then, that building was most often regarded in the scholarly literature as a creation of Murad II, which certainly is not the case. Architecturally, that's not a late 14th century building. And secondly, we have a strong documentary evidence showing that actually that building was built together with another one that Murad commissioned in Edirne, and they were part of the same endowment or Vakf that Murad established, and that Vakf also provided the staff and the personnel of this mosque. So this mosque was meant to elevate the urban core to a new level and probably give a push to the emerging town. So I would assume nothing too much was going on around before it. So probably there was some Muslim community in this area, but the real kick was given in the 1430s by this building, and then followed by the then governor of European provinces of the Ottoman Empire of Rumeli, Shihabuddin Pasha, who commissioned that bath and also that mosque. And if I'm to speculate, I believe these could be the predecessors of those buildings that we know existed early on and have been destroyed, and Shihabuddin just rebuilt those two. And soon there was a great caravanserai added, and a bedstand, a covered market that you probably don't see well, but let me change the view. So that's a better way to look at the cover market, and that was in all likelihood built by Sultan Mehmed II. So in a way, that was the beginning of setting an urban core, which is a relatively established pattern in other Ottoman, in other cities controlled by the Ottomans. So the question is, what happened with the rest of the urban tissue? Almost simultaneously with the development of the urban core here, same person, Shihabuddin Pasha, patronized and built a large complex that consists of a number of buildings, for instance, that T-type Imaret Xavier, and a number of other service buildings like the Hammam, but most notably like the Madrasa, the Muslim college, and the sub kitchen. So in a way, in my understanding, that complex was meant from urbanistic perspective to give an outer, to demark the outer end at the north. So we would assume that this space was empty at the time. But if we reverse the perspective and one gets through this bridge, also in a way, it worked as a dignified preview for those coming into the city. So could have had a double function and so on. I'll stop here. I hope this gives you an idea what was going on basically in the mid 15th century, and bring forth our main actor today. And I deliberately chose this fancy title. I agree, it's kind of amusing, but this comes from an eulogy written for our main actor today, Ismail Bey, written by the court poet Hadidi Isfahani. So there is a story behind, and I'll come back to it with the time. But let me give you an idea of who this person were, and most notably where he came from. So if we look at the Ottoman emirate in the early 1500s. You see a principality basically in Bithynia, and this is taken from an automatic software named Centenia, which I find great, but also there's some inaccuracies. So if you see inaccuracies, don't blame it on me. But as a whole, is a great tool that could visualize development over time. So the Ottoman Emirate emerged in Bithynia, but many claim that it emerged as Osman, the founder of the dynasty, was a frontier ward appointed by those people, which is another way older dynasty that ruled in Anatolia. And I don't want to get into the details, but let's say that by the 1350s, those Jandaриds were way more important and certainly wealthier people than the Ottomans in the 1350s. But fast forward like half a century, and Ottomans managed to establish control over the Balkans and also managed to deal with all the emirates in Anatolia. And exactly when the things were looking very, very prosperous for the Ottomans in 1402, they suffered a major defeat by Timur, who came from the east, and those beyliks, principalities, emirates were reestablished. So the Ottomans had to take a long time to reconquer, subdue all these principalities, and until only few remained, and we come to the point that is our starting point for the story of Filibe. In 1462, Mehmed II launched a campaign against the then ruler of the Jandarid or Isfendiyarids emirate, Ismail Bey. So if you ask me, it is most likely that was not the claim and the need of territory of the Ottomans, but rather Mehmed needed to put under his control the important ports of Sinop, the important port of Sinop actually, and the other important town of Kastamonu, which were controlled by the dynasty of Isfendiyarids. They were important for multiple strategical reasons, but mostly also because they were controlling the slave trade coming from Crimea, which meant a lot of money. So just a glimpse at the architectural patronage of Ismail Bey before he being deposed by Mehmed II in his home Kastamonu. One thing that really calls our attention is this complex that he patronized. In a way, very much reminds the one that Shihabuddin built in Plovdiv, both structurally and architecturally. It is another T-type building and a whole complex around it that included multiple buildings. But again, most notably, there was a madrasa and a mekteb where possibly many of the members of the family or the extended household were also trained. So I again don't want to get into these details because they are not too relevant for our case in Plovdiv, but John wanted to point to the fact that Ismail was a ruler of great prominence, and his titulature shows it, his architectural patronage shows it, and also he had a very well developed court structure. He patronized a number of Islamic scholars, endowing libraries, and most importantly for our case today, at some point the poet Khadidi also enjoyed the patronage of Ismail Bey while in Kastamonu, and then he moved to the Ottoman court and became a court poet in the Ottoman court. But when his former patron died in Plovdiv, he did not forget him, and he laid down this excellent elegy in verse in Persian, from which I got this quotation. So let's bring our actor to Plovdiv. And not too much is known as to how the details revealed, how the events revealed, but what one can say from what one can gather from the narrative sources from the chronicles is that Mehmet in a way tricked Ismail. He came with a large army. Apparently Ismail couldn't resist the Ottoman force, but Mehmet offered him a peaceful surrender and suggested that he will get other Bithynian towns in exchange of his 2 towns that Mehmet badly needed at that moment. Ismail accepted, but eventually Mehmet changed his mind, and chronicles say he transferred him to Plovdiv and to Filibe and gave him the nearby village in full proprietorship, which in a way does not look like a fair deal. And I was always wondering why there was no a substantial reaction until accidentally I found a document in the archive, which is a interesting document that offers additional details and different perspective. In its essence, it's a petition written by the grandson of Ismail, and it refers to an achname. An achname, that is a bill of oath reflecting some sort of contractual agreement between 2 sides. In European context, this is most known as capitulations that Ottomans often signed with the Christian rulers, and they're terribly understudied in terms of what Ottomans did with the Muslim rulers. So apparently the family had such an achname, or Ismail Bey himself signed such an achname, and that was lost in the family. And the grandson, I mean, it's a pretty bad loss, if you ask me. That seems like an important document that one must keep better. But the grandson asked for a copy of this document, and he reveals part of the stipulations in the achname, which was signed by Mehmet and Ismail. In short, the document says that Mehmet directly placed Filibe and the surroundings under the protection and care of Ismail, which in other terms would mean that he gave him the governorship and the rulership over the area. But more notably, we get an idea about the amount of money involved in the process. So Ismail was granted 3 million silver coins, Ottoman silver coins, at the beginning, and then received a quite generous daily stipend, which also allowed him to do things. Further details about what happened to his family, his sons. The eldest sons received very good appointments. Funnily, the document is also confirmed by Angelello's Historia Turcesca. So actually, the content of the document is not a false claim, and then we can quite safely track the father of the petitioner through his career based on other documents. So I'm bringing this to your attention just to say that Ismail actually did not come to Plovdiv alone. It's not just the governor appointed. He's not a civil servant appointed by the Ottomans. He apparently appeared in the town with an extended household, or court, if you wish. So the document mentions 23 sons, and I have no idea how reliable this information might be. Could it be a reference to all the relatives that came together with him? More likely, but we know that there were close relatives that came with him, and also a household of the type would definitely involve a number of subordinates, definitely military retinues, number of slaves, and he certainly maintained a scholarly and artistic circle. We know that because during his stay in Plovdiv, he authored a widely read work on ritual perception of Islam and rulership. So he was quite engaged with the concept of rulership and authored a book. So now let's turn to the architectural patronage. What a person of such magnitude brought to rule over a town could do. Unfortunately, we don't have even a single of his buildings preserved. I should have started with that very often when we deal with the towns and cities in former Ottoman provinces that ended up in nation states in the Balkans, Ottoman architectural layer was often obliterated. And if I am to judge what's preserved from the Ottoman layer in Plovdiv, it's probably about 10% of what has ever been came to our days. So our architectural patronage of Ismail Bey is completely obliterated, but we know about it because he has two endowment deeds or vakfiyas, and those two vakfiyas specify two different types of architectural patronage that I'll briefly focus on. So if we go into the first and the earlier endowment deed, we would see that Ismail went for very early, almost immediately after his arrival, he started building something that could have been for the public representation. Just let me remind you that we would assume that this part was mostly built in by that time or in process, and that was completed. And so he would fill in the main commercial street with a mosque and a primary school, and also later on there will be a library. I'm not entirely sure whether that's his doing or the library appeared later on, but the only preserved photograph of this building that we can see is that gives us some idea. It's not a terribly spectacular building, but lays on the main street and probably was meant to attract settlers or in this newly formed neighborhoods. So the building has a graveyard, obviously, and the big German Turkologist Franz Babinger claims that Ismail Bey was buried there, and after him, Mahil Kil, who's an architectural architectural historian of the Ottoman Empire, also takes the idea and goes after it, and it is believed that Ismail is buried there, though other sources would say that actually Ismail Bey was buried in a mosque called differently and not in his own mosque, and it's called Bey Masjid. And this Bey Masjid is just on the opposite side of the city here, if that would be the city there on the eastern side of the city, and on its own is a focal point of a quarter, but also of a number of secondary streets that join this quarter. And it seems like an important place. And now, to make the long story short, there's a direct evidence that this mosque was built by his nephew. And then I was really wondering what made Ismail Bey's burial possible there, until I actually discovered that that building was placed on top of the highly ceremonial complex built by Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius. So in a way, that building, in my imagination, was meant to claim the ownership of the place, also by incorporating the dedicatory inscription of Marcus Aurelius in the walls of the mosque as polia. So the building was unfortunately knocked down in 1930s, and I don't even know how it looked like, but we know at least the precise location, and that's telling. So if we switch to the other endowment deed, that's a few years later, and more or less it deals with the number of buildings that Ismail patronized in his residential complex in the village of Markovo, but also what is most notable to us is that this endowment deed talks about the restoration of the Roman aqueduct. So the city was once supplied by several actually aqueducts, and to the best of my knowledge, those were not functioning at least since the 6th century or so. After the invasions of Avars and Slavs, those were not functioning. So in a way, Ismail resorted into repair and rebuild this this Roman aqueduct. And needless to say, the ritual importance of water in Islamic religious practices is crucial. So also from my own perception, is that is a way of providing for the social welfare by claiming and changing an architectural heritage that did exist in place, but is modified into serve into different needs. So I would think one of the most important deeds of Ismail Bey as governor of Plovdiv is rebuilding this aqueduct. We have no idea how did it look like. So this, what you see on the photograph down right, is a modern reconstruction of the local municipality. They assume that the Roman aqueduct should have looked like. I wouldn't think that the Ismail's aqueduct used those water bridges. Probably was a simpler construction, but but he also added to the urbanscape a water distribution station, and that water distribution station played again a crucial role in the development of urban fabric and of distribution of buildings in the area. And I'll try to show you how. First of all, we could identify the location. That's very near his mosque, on one of the main thoroughfares. Building is gone, of course, and the only illustration that I was able to find is that that picture by a Czech painter named Meriç, who worked in 19th century Plovdiv. But also it's very likely that this painting depicts a later reconstruction of that building and a thorough modification. But knowing the location, at least, of the building, which disappeared sometime in the 1880s, we could try to think about what importance it had to the development of the city. So that would be a reconstruction of the part of the Roman aqueduct, and those red ones are the bath houses, the public baths, hammams, that we know were certainly present in Ismail's lifetime. So apparently the Roman aqueduct, the part of the Roman aqueduct, would not go to that building. So although there is no direct archaeological evidence that might come in the future, I would assume that Ismail's aqueduct ran towards the main thoroughfare and connected to the water distribution station there. So what's the impact of all that? If we go fast forward again and you see that in the course of the remaining part of the 15th century and early 16th century, the baths in the city appear along this line, and it's very easy to imagine for somebody to extend this line and to imagine that these were connected. So that's one of the baths that also Mahir believes should have been patronized by Ismail Bey. And if that were the case, indeed, that's a extremely important building. It is by far the biggest bath that was meant to serve the tanneries of the town, and all those neighborhoods that you see around were inhabited primarily by tanners working in the tanneries. but I haven't been able to find a direct evidence, documentary evidence to confirm Mahiukil's hypothesis, and I tacitly embrace it, but I still have my doubts and looking for a really firm documentary evidence. So if we look at his patronage and patronage over the water supply system of Plovdiv, I don't think that Ismail Bey was in a way a unique player in the Ottoman world. So just to bring two more examples of people of probably similar magnitude who were also charged with the governorship of the cities in certain periods. One is Yahya Pasha, who built the water supply system of Sofia, and I would refer to the excellent piece of scholarship, this article of my colleague Stefan Peiche from Illinois that I provided with the reading materials. Stefan studied this the process and the endowment deed of Yahya Pasha. But I would also like to refer to this one here, which is meant to supply the water for Skopje, which was initiated by Isa Bey, a very prominent frontier ward, and then continued by Mustafa Pasha later on. And that's just to give you a visual representation of what might have looked like the aqueduct of Plovdiv as well at some point. And to sum up, I would really like to return to the notions that I began with, and to the notion specifically talking about the practical citizenship. And as long as I fully agree and I fully side with what has been said about the roles of the guilds as important intermediary, as the religious communities that really had their saying in so many local affairs and urban at an urban level, and specifically Martin talked about the VACs as meaning of social welfare and self-organization, and I also fully agree with that. But I would, if we reverse the perspective and we look at the so-called anonymous state that is basically should have been basically occupied with waging war and collecting money in a way, and let the citizens deal with their own business, I would think it's a little bit way more complicated, because what exactly the state constituted of in this early 15th century or up to the 16th century Balkan realities. If you look at the agents, very often one could see that they have pushed their own political agenda, and they have their own political schemes in mind. And I would say taking the research into the local and the individual level would often give us a way better way of understanding, because I wouldn't think that always the agents who were supposedly appointed by states acted in accordance with what the state might have pushed in the political agenda. And same way, if one looks at into the VACs, the charity endowments, okay, in a way that they are bottom-up initiative that could happen, but also I could see them the other way around. I could see them as top-down initiatives that people use the mechanisms for endowing property in order to preserve and maintain wealth and influence. And the multiple examples in the Balkans in the Ottoman context that this lasted well until the dissolution of the empire. And finally, if we think about the Ottoman and especially the Ottoman dynasty's practical use of governmental experience, Ismail Bey could be could be a good example, because in the very essence, Ottoman Sultan appointed a fallen rival, a fallen sultan of his own, to implement his experience in a completely unknown environment in European territories, and implement the practices that he has already acquired, governmental practices that he has already acquired for so many years, and that's probably transferable in the dynasty as well. So on that note, I think I shouldn't abuse the time any longer, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Griego. That was fascinating. I mean, wonderful to see, on the one hand, this specific focus on one place, as you say, very significant late medieval, early modern city, but also these connections stretching across the Balkans. I mean, I rarely hear a lecture where Kruševac and Rhodes are more or less mentioned in the same sentence. So I really enjoy the kind of larger geography as well. And you raised so many interesting points. I'm particularly grateful to you for referring to some of our previous lectures and ideas about citizenship and what it actually means practically and theoretically and architecturally. So I think that's worked very well. Now, of course, the floor is open to all of you. We tend to prefer or give preference to our students. But obviously all of you are welcome to ask questions. So just raise your hand as per usual, and indeed we have one already, and then switch on your mic. So Joshua, do you want to kick off?
Hi, first off, thank you so much for the lecture. It's an area and a topic I've not really seen covered before. I had a quick question though on the retinues that you had mentioned previously. There was a military retinue as well as a slave retinue. Do you have any idea if these were local or outside groups that were brought in? So like, for instance, with the Ottoman Empire, they had the famous Janissary system, which would, I'm assuming, not have been sent to a local lord, but I don't know enough to say that. Would these be like private mercenaries brought in? Would they be a local unit that's raised? And for these slaves, would that be something that's also being imported as well?
Thank you. That's a great question, actually. Certainly they were not Janissaries. That's a completely different system of recruit and management. But I would say most families in the Balkans of some prominence who were engaged in warfare would have had their own small personal armies that guarded, on the one hand, the household, on the other hand, that is a system that bound them together into a wider patron-client network. And those retinues could be, well, in the case of somebody coming from Anatolia, I would assume, I have no data on that, don't get me wrong. I'm just, in the case I'm speculating, but judging from analogous cases, I would assume he would have had Anatolians with him, who are people who are raised already in the dynasty and trained for multiple services that they could render in the services, including military services. But slaves are mostly acquired as booty, as spoils of war, or purchased, of course. But given the occupation of these people, it's probably way cheaper to participate in campaigns where he captured the slaves. And as a side issue, not so rarely, those slaves could be promoted also in the household. If they get the proper training in one direction or another, they could raised into some prominence in the household of these prominent wards.
Thank you so much.
Just looking that I'm not missing any other raised hands. Well, oh yes, Isidore. Hello, Isidore. Good evening.
Hello
Nice
again.
to see you again.
Yes, you as well. Thank you, Gregor. That was wonderful. Because you mentioned wax, you probably know Alan Mikhail's thesis that basically this was, at least in Egypt, let's call it like early modern version of democracy, like trying to negotiate with the Sultanate, first with the Ottoman officials in Egypt, and then as an extension with the imperial capital in Constantinople. So I was wondering, what do you think of his thesis? So that would be a first question. And then a bit broader and perhaps even more controversial, the thesis of hydraulic empires. What do you think about that? Just in general, you probably know the thesis that basically these empires control the population by controlling the water supply. Go at it. Thanks.
Thank you. These are two great questions. I'll probably start with the second. I really like both Mikhail's ideas and scholarship, but in the case of hydraulic empires, in the case of exercising complete control over the water supply, I don't think it's that much applicable into the Balkans. You know, that thesis stands ground in different geographies. You know, it suffices to take a ride through the Balkans to see the abundance of water, and actually that nobody would eventually control it. And for this reason, very rarely, again, to the best of my knowledge, in the Balkans, we encounter cases of privatized rivers or streams that have been turned into WACFs or whatever, you know, whether it could be the state authority that executes control of private individuals. I would think in the Balkans that's not so much the case. Yet again, that said, it doesn't mean that the Ottomans did not invest heavily in building hydraulic infrastructure in the Balkans, but that's mostly related to rice production. And in suitable places, and Thrace is one of these, I failed to mention that Ottomans saw great potential of the rice growing in Thrace, and that very soon turned into one of the biggest supplies of rice in the empire. There have been generations and generations of both sultans and private individuals investing in building private water infrastructure, like including dams and irrigation channels. But that's a tiny fraction of the Balkans. If you look at the mountains, this doesn't work so much. You know, it's an yes and no, if that satisfies you as an answer. I think it's a great thesis, but you know, there's a geographic limitation, and the WACF issue is crucially important, of course. And what I again failed to mention is that the WACF that these two WACFs that Ismail established in Plovdiv were very soon later, you know, a decade later or something, confiscated by Mehmed II in a process that, you know, happened all over the empire, but particularly targeted those individuals, individual dynasties and large families that tried to transform their economic might and economic and political might into something more permanent. And Mehmed confiscated those vibes, this changed the game, and that didn't was long because his son Bayezid II restored back to those influential families the proprietorship of the foundations. So it has always been in a way a process of negotiation, and a few sultans would dare to challenge those influential families directly, Mehmed being one of them, and it didn't work quite long in the Balkans. So his son actually, if he really wanted to keep his throne, had to deal with these people and cut a deal and restore the properties of the important families.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Griego. Patrick's been patiently waiting. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Griego. That was absolutely fascinating, and it's wonderful to see how you're able to reconstruct the urban space of this city so impressively, actually. And that's also what my question is about. When the Ottomans, also before Ismail, but possibly Ismail himself, were building all these things, were they mainly building on empty land, or were they requisitioning spaces that had been previously inhabited? I wonder whether you're able to say anything about that, though I appreciate it must be difficult to say.
Yeah, that's a great question, and actually this is the essence of everything. I ask myself the same question all the time. That's why I try to project to the best of my abilities the data back in time. Okay, one thing we know for sure, Ottomans did not care much about the urban structure that the Romans set, except for finding good places to appropriate and claim some legitimacy, like putting your mosque on the top of Triumphal Arch, for instance. But as a whole, they moved out the city at a different location. So pretty much nothing Roman was involved except for spolia laying around structurally. And you see the main road cutting through the stadium, which is a clear indication that the stadium was buried. Well, the problem is I can't say much about the medieval period, the period that precedes the Ottoman. Because on the one hand, first of all, the architecture is not so imposing. That leaves clearly distinguishable signs that could be, that could allow the archaeologists to recreate a better urban fabric, the urban fabric of the time. But also our knowledge is limited by the fact that it is somewhat less known, the medieval period. So overall, I would say in the medieval period, we definitely have some continuity that we can see in the Christian parts. So the churches remained intact, pretty much. I would assume also that the street pattern of the citadel was intact throughout, most of the period. But what happens beyond the citadel is unknown to me, and it's also unknown to the archaeologists. And I've spoken to a lot of people asking, okay, would there be anything of prominence in the area where the Ottomans built the city? And people would say, frankly, probably not, but we don't know. Actually, we don't know. Probably not, because there are not so many clear signs of indicating that there was major urban infrastructure in this area. So most of the Ottoman buildings were built over empty, or if not entirely empty, over places that had either insignificant residential architecture or were at the periphery of what the medieval town was. So generally, almost empty, but we can never be sure about that. Well, one more remark. Now, because this Muradi Mosque that I showed is not very smartly placed, partially on top of the wall, of the city wall. So that's a clear indication that by 1530s the wall was gone, and one corner of the mosque sits on this wall, which gives a way more stable foundation than the rest of the building, and eventually it cracked. Okay, also it helped very much that the stadium is nearby, and the local authorities were very keen on excavating beneath the mosque to show the stadium. So it's a complicated situation. But the mosque at some point cracked and needed really emergent efforts to stabilize it. And that also included excavations beneath the foundations of the mosque. And I was very curious what will come out. Unfortunately, nothing came out. It's entirely empty place. So there's no building beneath. There's nothing really remarkable beneath, except for the walls. So that's one building that has been excavated in a way, and we know what's beneath. I don't know whether this answers your question.
No, absolutely does. Thank you so much. It is fascinating to think that possibly, if I understand you correctly, the Ottomans might have actually built almost a new city close to where there was something else, which is really interesting.
Harun Yeni is next. Do you want to meet yourself?
Hi, good evening all. Thank you very much, Gregor, for this wonderful speech. It has been a long while since I have listened to you. And you were again fantastic. I had a question which, in relation to your answer a few questions ago, you were mentioning about the confiscation of Mehmet II. Actually, the question in my mind was about that. I may have missed, but have you ever confronted with the confiscation issues related to Ismail Bey or his retinue or family? Thank you very much.
Harun, so good to see you. Well, as I said, the VAC was confiscated, if that is your question, but didn't last long. And then the VAC remained in family possession until 1877-78, or slightly later, okay, when the province of Eastern Rumelia was established, and Ottomans were largely gone. In the beginning, the Eastern Rumelian government kept the VACs of those important families. And then in 1885, when the two parts of what today consists Bulgaria joined, then those VACs were appropriated by the state, and the relatives of Ismail Bey started long wave of petitioning and trying to get something back of their properties and some of their rents. But that's a different story. So in one word, yes, it was confiscated, but it was returned and preserved in the families. So family played an important role until the dissolution of the empire, when they all moved to Istanbul.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Tunda, do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It was really nice to hear you again, Grigor. It's been a while. Thank you. It was really fascinating to hear about Filibe. And my question is regarding to the merchants. I don't know if you know what kind of role they played in the Ottoman period of Filibe, and just very shortly, and what was their composition, if you know that, and what was the role of Filibe in the domestic or the long distance trade of the Ottomans.
Thank you, Tunda. First of all, so good to see you again. That's a great question. Well, as a matter of fact, I don't know too much about the merchants, and there's a particular reason about it. We, in a way, lack most of the sources that could have been the best source to study the commercial activities. These are the local court records. So we have no notary records or anything from Plovdiv, unfortunately. These are all gone somewhere, lost, hopefully not forever, but for the time being, the best records are not preserved. And also, I didn't have a particular interest in the topic. But what I can say is that both domestically and in the long distance trade, Plovdiv was an extremely important point. Now, let's begin with the long distance trade. And as I think, if I'm not mistaken, as early as late 15th century, there'll be a community of Raguzan or Dubrovnik merchants in the city who actually resided in the Khan of Shihabuddin Pasha there at the edge of the river. And that community was not very big. It's incomparable to the one in Sofia or the one in Adrianople, but it was still very active. So the long distance trade was very well present in Plovdiv. So if for domestic trade, I mean, both for long distance and for domestic trade, if you look at the location of the place, it obviously trade passed through it, and apparently there were merchants. Also, if you look at the architectural infrastructure, there are multiple Khans, inns, so which is also in a way telling about very vibrant economic life and trade life. But unfortunately, I cannot cite any specific data because A, we have very little sources. B, I never really looked into that. And probably to satisfy your curiosity, the best answer that I could give is yes, it was important. But if you want me to quantify how important, that'll be very difficult. I have nothing much to offer.
Thank you.
Grigory, if we're not tiring you out, I wondered whether I could ask a question. I mean, actually, it's kind of aligns itself a little bit with Patrick's question about architecture. And I was really struck by how much more urbanized the Ottoman period of Plovdiv looks. I mean, that kind of idea of a citadel and a settlement around it close to the river that we see, you know, in the kind of Christian or medieval period looks very familiar. But this is much more sophisticated with all these kind of public amenities. And when you talked about Ismail Bey, and he's about, what, 18 years presence in Filibe and Plovdiv, and the kind of first act of patronage was that mosque. And unfortunately, I have to confess that I had a power cut, so I was kind of knocked out for about 10 minutes. I'm sorry if you explained this, but there's that main street, that kind of that leads towards the bridge and the river, where most of these public institutions seem to be aligned and they're kind of accruing gradually. That really fascinated me because, you know, this is a kind of pattern that you find in lots of different places. You know, Florence has Via del Calzaioli, which connects Duomo and the Piazza della Signoria. You know, Prague does something similar. These kind of, you know, Paul Crossley, my former supervisor friend, called axes of meaning. You know, is there something like that you find in Ottoman cities, that kind of really important avenue which attracts patronage, personal, public, you know, public institutions, personal commemoration, because it's the place to be seen. Yeah, attracts lots of footfall, whatever reason. Certain public decorum, anyway.
Well, thank you. That's also a great question, and very much yes. And I should have explained better that this main axis actually is the main commercial street of the city. So it became the backbone of the city, and attracted most of the commercial patronage there, as you can imagine. So that, according to 17th century traveler Evliya Çelebi, that was the only paved street in the city. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, he says about 200, 200 or 300 shops are aligned along the main street. So if we leave those shops aside, I myself could find a number of inns and other commercial infrastructure that was built along the street. Is that a terribly peculiar thing to Plovdiv? Rather not. There will be similar cases. Very much it depends on the pattern, of course, of the street pattern. But I can think of other examples where there is one very prominent street that attracted a lot of patronage, both commercial and possibly representative as well. So that's not a unique feature of Plovdiv. If you look at Skopje, for instance, I can think of, or Bursa also has rather more access that join in the center, but I wouldn't think it's a unique feature.
Thank you, fascinating. Any more questions from our audience, I wonder? Don't see any hands. Then I can ask another, which is more about cultural heritage. I think it was Byzantine Mosque, which was built over the classical ruins, over the original gates. Is that right? Did I remember correctly?
Sorry, your connection broke down. I couldn't hear.
Sorry, I was just wondering, there was the mosque, it was a Byzantine Mosque, which was built over the
nephew. Yeah.
So that was destroyed in the 1930s, you said, or something like that, yeah? So is there a kind of, sorry, this is a really kind of coming from a place of ignorance, was there a tendency to, in terms of rescuing heritage, to kind of favor pre-Ottoman periods, so Christian and classical and not Ottoman cultural heritage, architectural heritage? So was it excavation focusing on Roman ruins, but actually destroying the process? Is there a pattern? Or is this a very controversial thing to ask?
No, I wouldn't say it's controversial. I think it's very simple. Unfortunately, up until probably 30, 40 years ago, everything Ottoman was just thrown in the garbage until we get to the real stuff. And the real stuff would be, okay, there might be something medieval, but we aim at the antiquity and whatever Roman we can find. That was the approach. And I'm not entirely sure whether the mosque was knocked down because of the excavations or was knocked down because of somebody's urbanistic decision to open more space exactly where the mosque is, as it happened in some cases. There was a clear tendency of clearing up Ottoman architectural heritage. I would say Plovdiv is not a tragic case, because if you look at the street pattern, at least you could see partially preserved the tissue of the Ottoman town, especially this commercial area. That was due, on the one hand, to the fact that there was a very smart urban architect after the Ottomans were gone, a Czech person named Josef Schnitter, but also partially due to the fact that this was a very vivid area and not major modernizations happened in the, all of a sudden to the infrastructure. So if one compares the degree of preservation of Plovdiv to that of Sofia, for instance, which is pretty much comparable town in the Balkans, I would say Plovdiv is way better preserved, and you can sense something Ottoman, or the Ottoman heritage is more sensible in Plovdiv than in Sofia, not only in terms of architecture, but also in terms of the general layout of the town.
Thank you, which only shows how much this kind of research must be quite complicated and complex, finding evidence, visual, written, and so on. Okay, any more last chance for any more questions? No, I don't see any raised hands. Well, in that case, we can let you go to have your dinner and relax a little bit. And thank you very much for this fascinating talk,
I thank
and
you.
for expanding our mental and geographical borders further. I'm very, yes, applause all around. I'm very happy to say that this is not the end. We have one more lecture by Ferenc Hirscher. This is next week. We're going to be talking to us about political ideology of the Renaissance and early modern city. In fact, I'm just putting this in a chat link, so please sign up for that. And thank you again all for your interesting questions, but above all, thank you, Griego, for a fascinating talk. Okay, thanks.
My pleasure.
And,
thank you too.
Goodbye all. Thanks, till next week. Bye.